Believe me when I say I hate this part just as much as you do, albeit for different reasons. I hate it because of the prevalent and overwhelmingly terrible strategies taught by many agencies, and you hate it because it makes you cry. We are still not doing answer show question and not having a laugh about how stupid the questions are and how stupid we are. So let's power through this. Today we have a few Retell Lecture questions to be discussed. We will talk note-taking, sentence phrasing, and everything else on how to properly address Retell Lecture. Unlike the pile of crap that you got from a friend of a friend who paid agencies for tens of hours of classes and ended up getting nothing out of it. Let's quickly remind ourselves why we dislike Retell Lecture so much. You listen to a passage and you space out for 10 seconds and damn! The mic has already begun recording. So you have to say something, preferably stuff related to the audio, all the while maintaining your best possible speech. Fluency and pronunciation will be scored, so the best way is, for the millionth time, you quote-unquote read out a script developed by your notes and your practice. When note-taking, get straight to the point so it will partially form your final speech. In this way, you will save yourself a lot of trouble, and don't focus too much on the trivial details. They are called trivial for a reason. They're only additional to the core messages. You get the most important pieces of info, where there usually exists 4 to 5 of them, you're basically set. Simplify your speech, be concise, and then you can achieve true happiness. Today, we'll follow the format used in the crash course. I'll play the audio, then reveal an ideal list of notes, quickly go through them, and lastly give you 2 versions of the possible answers. The first will be the skeleton of the passage without much added detail, and the second one will be bloody fantastic. Oh, by the way, some Retell Lecture questions will be accompanied by an image, occasionally a video clip. I kinda forgot to mention this in the crash course because it's not for every question, and they're there as an extra to the audio, not a substitute of any kind. So you will not miss anything if you don't look at the pictures at all. You can still get everything from listening. In fact, the images can sometimes be more distracting than helpful, and you pretty much have no time in advance to look at them. So if you find yourself confused by the image, my advice would be just ignore them. So here we go. This is the first question.
The shuttle was designed to be a space truck. It's a multi-purpose vehicle. We've done a tremendous number of different things with it. It's the most versatile space vehicle that has ever been built. We've used it to launch satellites. We've used it to repair satellites in orbit and put them back into orbit. We've used it to capture satellites and bring them back to Earth for repair. We've outfitted it with the Space Lab built by our European partners and used it before the era of the space station to do scientific research. We used it as part of our partnership with the Russians, which is still continuing, first as part of the Mir space station, where we actually prolonged the useful life of Mir by several years through logistical supply visits with the shuttle. And now, of course, we're using it to build the new International Space Station, which is a huge international partnership.
One thing to look out for. Some of the listening passages you get during the test will be like this one, containing background noise and being mediocre quality. Hence the importance of your neighbors to keep their decibels low so that you don't have to kill them one by one after the test. Or kill together, depending on your capabilities and choice of method. In this case, the picture does give a general idea of what you will be hearing about. It's about a space shuttle, and surprise surprise, the speaker talked about the shuttle in the very first sentence. This proves my point that the images are usually slightly helpful at best, and for now, we can get rid of it. Let's take a look at my notes. If you ever find yourself struggling to write down the words during the test, feel free to come up with symbols, abbreviations, drawings, or if you like, notes in another language. Completely up to you, and be reminded that you can choose to not take notes at all if you can't focus on the audio. This passage doesn't contain that much information, and they are quite simple. Notice how I write down more than just the keywords to give me a sense of how the sentence structures can be arranged. If you don't have trouble with note-taking, then spending a little more time during the listening part can save you a lot of effort when speaking. This is very helpful given that you only have 10 extra seconds after the audio finishes to organize your speech. By now you might have noticed something. This dude talks quite slowly, which is a good thing for you guys, so this passage is more on the easier side, even though there are some big brain words throughout the passage. I'm warning you guys because the simple version will be very short, probably even shorter than you would imagine. The next part mainly focuses on introducing the space shuttle as a multi-purpose vehicle. This is something that you can choose not to say, simply because after hearing this bit, you should have an idea that he was going to talk about what the purposes actually are, and those are definitely more significant. So what exact purposes does it serve? The very first usage being mentioned is how it interacts with satellites. This is quite an important vocabulary. If you don't know what this word means, then you are screwed for this part. In that case, I would recommend you just skip this part entirely. There are other functionalities of the space shuttle, so once again, don't choke. It is said that the space shuttle launches and repairs satellites and brings them back to Earth. You definitely don't have to cover everything, and in this kind of situation, mentioning that it works with the satellites should be enough. The next function is something that everyone should be able to get. It's quite simple. It helps with scientific research carried out in space. Again, as to how you say it, I don't really care. Bottom line is that you mentioned how it has something to do with scientific research. The next part can be a bit confusing because it used some terminologies that you might not know, but the keywords that you should get are space stations. So it is used to supply existing space stations and to help build new ones. There is a bit more info that you might want to cover regarding the last function. The speaker went on to say that building the space station is a part of an international partnership. You probably don't have to mention Russians specifically, even though he used it as an elaboration on who the partners are, but feel free to put it in if you know how to keep it simple. Here it's the short version. Maybe too short to feel legit, but it definitely is legit. So here it goes. This lecture is about a space shuttle. It has many functions. The first is to launch and repair satellites. It can also be used for scientific research in space. It supplies current space stations, and it is used to build new ones with an international partnership. I had to add in just a bit more info, which I considered non-essential just to make it longer. I probably don't have to mention many functions, and I might be able to cut out international partnership. Everything else though should give you an idea on what exactly you should cover at a minimum. Here comes the big boy version. This lecture is about a multi-purpose space shuttle. One of its functions is to launch satellites, repair them in orbit, or retrieve them back to Earth. It is also equipped to perform scientific research in zero gravity. It can make logistic runs to supply existing space stations, and in an international relationship with the Russians, it is commissioned to carry out construction of the new International Space Station. For this one, I pretty much covered everything there is in the answer. Maybe I can go even further with a bit more detail, but I choose not to. It's not like I can get bonus points for doing that, so let's move on to the next one.
In an article that you wrote that I just read, you said you wished you could take everyone back to decades ago to look at the Florida Keys.
50 years ago, think about how much change has taken place in that short period of time. We have managed to consume on the order of 90% of the big fish in the ocean, the tunas, the swordfish, the sharks. They're mostly gone. Until recently, people have had the belief that there isn't much we puny human beings could do to change the nature of the ocean, but in fact, we have, not just because of what we've been taking out, and the destructive means often applied to take fish and other creatures from the sea, but also what we're putting into the sea, either directly or what we put into the atmosphere that falls back into the sea.
So if you were going to give a grade on the health of the oceans today, what would it be?
Well, it depends on which aspect. Across the board, the oceans are in trouble. It's hard for me to assign a specific grade, maybe C-.
This time, the image is really not that helpful. For the last question, it at least gave you an idea of what the thingy the speaker was talking about. You know, the space thing, a ship or something like that. This picture tells you that we have eaten 90% of the big fish, and it happened to be the most obvious info delivered in the audio as well. There are two people in this recording. One is the interviewer and the other the interviewee. you can pretty much ignore whatever the interviewer says. Like, I would bet most of you guys don't even know what Florida Keys is. Hell, I don't think all of you know where Florida is. I myself had never even heard of the Florida Keys before coming across this question. All I'm saying is, please don't put it in your answer. It has nothing to do with the upcoming information. The interviewer is just trying to make conversation, and this is part of the skill sets tested by Retell Lecture to see if you can tell those two ladies apart, and more importantly, who actually gives the useful info. So the key message is that we are eating all of the big fish. It mostly happened within the past 50 years, but once again, don't feel the compulsion to put in the number if you didn't get what the number means. Then the interviewee mentioned 3 types of fish: tunas, swordfish, and sharks. If they were listed in another lecture, I would say they don't matter too much. However, for this particular question, there really isn't that much else. Therefore, the 3 types of fish should be considered slightly more important. It's all about the relative significance when compared to the other provided details in the passage. I don't really like the next part. The interviewee went on to talk about how puny humans have such a big impact on the ocean, but she was more like rambling, so it's quite likely that you missed this. What's worse is the upcoming bit about humans not only taking fish out of the ocean, but also putting things back into it. I can sense your confusion. She also talked about how things we put into the atmosphere can fall into the ocean. This is what I meant when talking about how IELTS and PTE listening are different. For IELTS passages, you will most certainly get the keyword pollution somewhere in the audio, but not necessarily for PTE. That's why I emphasize so heavily on understanding the passage. If you know that she was talking about pollution, hasn't this question just miraculously become like 80% easier? Then the interviewer jumped back in and asked to give a grading. Like, what the hell? If this audio is truly picked from an interview, she doesn't sound like a professional. The interviewee sounded baffled and just gave a C-. This is not important at all. What's more important is before that when she said the ocean is in trouble because we eat too much sushi and we dump pollution into the waters. Don't ever feel the need to talk about Florida Keys or C-. Man, these simple answers seem to be getting shorter. This lecture barely lasted a minute and it's stuffed with useless talking. If you still manage to come up with an answer that lasts 40 seconds, please tell me how you did it. Here is my simplistic approach. This lecture is about the ocean. Humans have consumed about 90% of the big fish in the past 50 years. We are also polluting the ocean both directly and through the atmosphere. The ocean is in big trouble. What more do you want me to talk about? But to be fair, I would be very hesitant to give such a short answer if I hadn't done it myself in the test. I am living proof that giving a 15-second Retell Lecture answer is good enough to get a perfect score. Remember the scoring trifecta: fluency, pronunciation, and content. The length doesn't concern fluency or pronunciation. For those two, you just have to make sure that whatever you decide to talk about are said well. Content is the only factor that might affect the length of your answer. But for passages like this one, do you really need to drag it out? Oh boy, how am I supposed to flex this one? I'll find a way. Here we go. This lecture is about how the interviewee feels nostalgic about the past, 50 years ago to be precise. Back then, humans hadn't caught and consumed over 90% of the big oceanic fish, such as tunas, sharks, and swordfish, which is disastrous for the ecosystem. It is hard to believe that humans can exert such a huge impact on the environment, not just by fishing alone, but also by pollution, both directly and indirectly through the atmosphere. Our actions have severely endangered the ocean. Wow, it's hard to force that one out. I think you can agree that these two questions are both quite easy. Is that a no? I think I heard yes. Alright then, challenge accepted. Let's get to the last example, which is a lot more entertaining, difficult.
What nutritional guidelines should we be following?
Well, probably the best source of nutritional guidelines are those that are issued by the American Cancer Society or the National Cancer Institute. And the American Cancer Society, for example, offers 4 really basic, simple nutrition guidelines. The first guideline, which in my mind is the most important, is to choose most of the foods that you eat from plant sources. And we can talk in more detail about that in a moment. The second guideline is to limit your intake of high-fat foods, particularly from animal sources. The The third guideline is to be physically active and achieve a normal, healthy body weight. And the final guideline is to limit consumption of alcoholic beverages if you choose to drink at all.
So, Susan, one of the things we always hear about from the American Cancer Society is this 5-a-day recommendation. Maybe if you could explain to our listening audience what that actually means.
The 5-a-day recommendation is a very simple way of communicating the message to increase consumption of these plant foods. And what 5-a-day means is 5 servings per day of fruits and vegetables in total. And some people misunderstand this guideline, and they may think it's okay if I have 5 glasses of fruit juice a day and I've met my 5-a-day guideline. But the goal is really to choose both fruits and vegetables as part of the 5-a-day guideline, to vary the fruits and vegetables that you eat on a daily basis, and that alone is a very major step forward in terms of reducing your risk for cancer.
So yeah, this length is more like something you would expect for a typical Retell Lecture question. The speech is quite hasty, especially the lady who happens to be the one giving the actual information. That dude can mostly be ignored, but at least he's a better interviewer than the last one. The image is good in the sense that it tells you there are 4 important things you should pay attention to, but the second one isn't quite accurate. We'll get to that. The dude asks the question, what nutritional guidelines should we be following? This is the first tip that the passage will be about food and eating food. Then comes the 4 basic guidelines recommended by the lady, which are also shown in the picture. I'll give you a simple rule of thumb. If you have 4 things in the list, try to talk about at least 3. Preferably you would talk about them all, but you have my approval to leave out one of them. The first guideline is more from plant sources, or put simply, eat more fruits and vegetables. If you didn't get this from the audio, you should be able to figure this one out by looking at the picture. The second guideline isn't exactly have less meat. This is the inaccurate part. It was actually talking about cutting down intake of fat, and the missing keyword is particularly from animal sources. Quick thought exercise. What's more important here, animal sources or fat? I'd say it should be fat, but you say whatever the heck you want. The third is to be physically active and achieving a normal healthy body weight. If you only look at the picture, you will probably get the exercise part, but not the body weight. Doesn't concern me too much. Just make sure that you have something to say for at least 3 out of the 4 guidelines. The last guideline is less alcohol, even though she phrased it to be more difficult than it needed to be. What exactly did she say? Be patient. You might see it in the beautifully elaborative version when we get to it. No promises. However, we are actually not done. The message isn't only about those 4 guidelines. In order to achieve full content, you have to talk about at least 2 more things. The first is what the guidelines are designed for. There's actually a very specific purpose that the lady mentioned quite a few times, to reduce the risk for cancer. This is what you should be able to get throughout the passage. The word appeared in the name of the institutes that came up with those guidelines, and in the very last sentence, she talked about their effects for lowering the risk for cancer. Remember to say the word cancer at least once. The next would be the 5-a-day recommendation. If you want to be lazy, you can just mention the name. There is a big discussion about what it actually means and what to look out for, but for the sake of simplicity, I wouldn't worry too much about those details. This is like the complete opposite of the last question. The last one had too little info, so the details are comparatively more important. This passage, on the other hand, had too much info because the interviewee was talking like a machine gun, so trivial details matter less. Yes, I can finally do a proper flex. But first, here comes the Fast and Furious version. This lecture is about nutritional guidelines. The first is to have more from plant sources, and the second one is to have less fat. The third is to be active and have a healthy weight, and the fourth is to drink less alcohol. There's also a 5-a-day recommendation. Their purpose is to reduce the risk for cancer. Please pay attention to the structures I use. I chose to use simple sentences and nothing too complicated. This will save you a ton of trouble if you can also learn how to express yourself with conciseness and clarity. What you don't have to learn, at least not for now, is how to do this upcoming monstrosity. This lecture provides nutritional guidelines approved by cancer societies to lower one's risk for cancer. Having more portions coming from plant sources is considered the most important. One should also limit foods with high fat content, especially from animals. It is also crucial to be physically active and to maintain a healthy weight. Lastly, consumption of alcoholic beverages should be restricted or eliminated. The 5-a-day recommendation suggests 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, with emphasis on both diversity and variety. Let's do a quick wrap-up. Retell Lecture is a question type that requires quite substantial proficiency for listening and speaking, so it is supposed to be difficult. Whatever methods you end up choosing to use, don't ever forget the basics. Understand the core idea, and then talk about them using simple sentences, along with some extra details you picked up. In most cases, this will give you a very good answer. This concludes the speaking section. Well, at least the question types that score fluency and pronunciation. It is very important for you to practice your speech and delivery, and it's a good thing that they are mostly universal for all relevant questions. And congratulations, you have survived thus far, and we can take it easy for a while until we are done mocking the answer show question, and then we can cry together going through the writing part. Let's not deny something for months and then accidentally admit it on live television because you wanted to brag about yourself. And I'll see you all next time.